So Apple created a commercial that was so bad they apologized for it. That's right. You might have heard about this commercial because it kind of went viral. They took this hydraulic compressing massive metal thing and they compressed a piano and a mannequin and a globe and paint supplies and a whole bunch of other works of art or things that create works of art, and they compressed it down and they apologized. They came out and said, yeah, we shouldn't have done this. We weren't in line with our community or our values. And yet, this episode that we discuss is going to be all about that without the context of their apology, because we recorded it a day before they made that apology. Hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to What Would Jesus Tech? My name is Andrew Noble. I am joined with Joel. I'm also joined with Austin. And guess what? I'm just going to spill the beans right up front. We have a new co-host. Austin Gravely. We stole him from a competing podcast, which we saw rising on the charts. And we're like, we got to steal this guy away. Seriously. Yeah, you've met him before. He's been on the podcast before. He is the social media manager at the Gospel Coalition. Austin, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It is a true joy and delight to be here. I had a blast talking with y'all back in what was that? December?
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that. And that episode was fun because as soon as we finished recording, I could tell that something was wrong with my throat. And by the end of the day, I had completely lost my voice and would not have a voice for about 2 weeks. I then went and preached a sermon on Zechariah's prophecy of John the Baptist, and my lack of a voice was the best sermon illustration I could have asked for.
Nice.
One correction just for you and for our audience, because this is something that happens with me all the time, is that Gravely is the historically correct pronunciation for my last name. But somewhere in my family line, we decided that we wanted to be different. And we wanted to flip the L and the E around to where it's actually Gravely instead of Gravely. I don't know why my ancestors decided to do that. I don't know why they didn't stick with the spelling that all of my other ancestors had used throughout history. But for some reason, we just decided, no, we want to be Gravely instead of Gravely. And so that's what it is.
All right. Well, I will go with the historically correct and be a traditionalist. No, Gravely. I'll try to remember that. That's helpful. Sorry to mispronounce it. Today we are talking about Apple. We're talking about the fact that their logo is a reflection of what happened in the garden, and maybe they're all about sin, or maybe Apple is about good technology use and they do amazing things, and Steve Jobs' promise of a bicycle for your brain could come true with the latest iPad. You know, maybe there is something good and inherently good in creativity that Apple exudes. Who knows? What's your opinion, listener? We're going to dive into that today. The latest reason to talk about this is something that's been swirling around online. The advertisement that Tim Cook tweeted out, and that advertisement got a lot of criticism, but also a lot of likes. It did not get ratioed, as they say. There is not more negative comments compared to the number of likes. So how do we respond to it? Austin, you said we got to talk about this. What was your first reaction to this video?
My first reaction was that, just putting on my pure marketing messaging hat, I know that the team that worked on this had a wonderful vision for what they were wanting to do and the message that they were trying to send. And so watching the reaction to that message and to see so many people take that ad and conclude things from it that were upsetting or distressing or concerning, that must have been hard for that team. And I am sympathetic for the genuinely talented creatives that worked on that ad, because it wasn't their intention to make anyone mad. It wasn't their intention to say things that they weren't trying to say. And yet that's the impact that it had. And so I saw it and I'm watching it with my marketing hats, like, okay, I know what's going on here. But then my media criticism hat saw this and went, oh boy, this is everything tech critics and tech pessimists have been saying and speaking about and writing about technology's impact on human creativity and the humanities, perfectly captured in a metaphor. And you couldn't do a better job of validating those fears and concerns than what Apple put out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for listeners' context, like if you're watching, you're seeing the video now, but you basically have this commercial that starts with a metronome, starts with a stereo player, starts with all of these different objects, things that have beauty inherent in them and the joy that they represent in creating music. You have little toys and stuffies and a trumpet, and they are all crushed. They are flattened, and the only thing left over after all of these things are flattened, including a grand piano and including paint that goes everywhere, after all of it, you have a single iPad, the thinnest iPad ever. Joel, what do you make of this ad?
Yeah, I mean, I saw the same way. I was like, oh boy, people are going to have a field day with this one. And it's like, even myself watching it, I, as let's say someone who typically bends more positively about technology, had this eerie feeling in me of like, oh, this is like, I'm watching things that broken. And it's like, they're not even like, it's not like garbage. Like, let's say you had garbage or something getting crushed at like a recycling facility. That's one thing where you almost don't feel bad about it. But this was like, oh, it's actually like a very beautiful looking, metronome or record player. And there's like an aesthetic nicety to that. And that was what was getting crushed. So I got it. It's actually not even just the thinnest iPad. It's like the thinnest Apple product ever. So from an engineering point of view, it is like really impressive what they've been able to do. And I get the concept, but it almost, tied on the backdrop of what else is happening with Apple, with their, them not leading in the AI race, their iPhone sales slumping and them doing stock buybacks. It's another one of the bullet points that said they've lost a signal or, they're losing their standing. So, taking what they just put out plus all these other things, it just, yeah, I can see why it became a trigger point on social media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like there is a whole world of crushing things and that being an enjoyable viewing experience. So that's where my mind went at first, because there's like the hydraulic press channel on YouTube that has 9.43 million subscribers. They have views on their videos numbering in the hundreds of millions. And there's really cool things that they do when they crush things. And doesn't it look cool to crush things by hydraulics? But what Apple did is they took that kind of idea that's kind of cool, and then they added VFX to it, and they added gimmicks to it. And then it stopped being really cool to see something crushed and the power of the object that crushes whatever is in its way. And it's like, wait, what's going on here? Okay, are they crushing everything into the iPad? Like, I was just confused when I first watched it, and it was only after I saw the comments that I was like, oh, this is why everyone's freaking out. So I think it does represent something of what Apple was trying to do versus what I think it actually did. I think there must have been a conversation amongst the marketers like, oh, maybe we shouldn't be crushing everything. Maybe that's the wrong signal. And then someone saying, well, no, that's not the point. Like, there was probably a back and forth. And I think as like good media critics, we should appreciate the intent of the communication in order to understand it. Like, and that's how you read the Bible. You don't just read John and take every verse for what you want it to mean and what you think it means. You need to understand the intent. So Apple creating this, their intent is not for it to destroy nature, but it's still destroying instruments, right?
Yeah, I feel like they could have done, if they really, I mean, maybe hindsight is just 2020, but they could have said, okay, we're not trying to crush things into a slim thing. We're compressing. So you come up with commercial and you do like shrink ray or something, and like it shrinks everything really small, and then you put these puzzle pieces together, and then you like see an iPad at the end, something like that. Then you're like, okay, you're maintaining, but just putting into a new medium, right?
Right.
So yeah, tone deaf maybe is like what other people are saying, and I think also it's like certain regions are having different reactions. So I know like in Japan, they're reacting more to it because they have more reverence of like, you know, these beautiful artistic objects of the past. So for them, it's almost like, and even in Asian culture, like growing up, my parents were like, oh, never step on a book, right? Because it's like, oh, it's like knowledge, all these type of things. So it's almost like disrespectful to break things like that.
And it's interesting. There was a variant that was circling around the next day where someone made a couple of light edits to the trailer and cut some parts and move some parts around. But instead of crushing things, you now start with the iPad. The iPad is the first thing in the shot. It's the center of the shot. The iPad gets crushed, and then it begins to go up and reverses that footage of everything being crushed. And so from this crushed iPad unlocks all of this creativity and beauty. And when I saw that version of the ad, I loved it. I thought it sold the point perfectly of like, yeah, you can do a lot of genuinely creative things with an iPad. I'm a musician. I have 4 guitars in my background. I've used an iPad in assisting me in playing guitar for the better part of a decade now. Like I absolutely love using an iPad to help me work on stuff. Had they reversed that, and had they done whether they had reversed it, you know, had it play in reverse like the modified version did, or something different, having it crushed into the iPad signaled erasure, whereas the reversed version signaled unlocked potential and creativity. And that's what the Apple message has always been, not the removal or the erasure of creativity.
Well, and it gets back to, what are these objects for? What is technology for? What is an iPad for? Does anybody know? Like, I think there are use cases for it that are fascinating, related to, like I watch a YouTuber who basically uses his iPad and uses the pencil or some tablet. I actually don't know if it's Apple or not. And he's a great designer, and he takes his design knowledge and he applies it through the medium of the tablet in order to create these beautiful images, and whimsical things and all this kind of stuff, and like communicates emotion through it. And there's an importance in beauty and in art, and an iPad is a device that maybe is more well suited to that as opposed to a keyboard and mouse. And they have a new pencil, and it has like this rotational gyroscope in it now that allows it to be very, very precise, to pick up on every single movement and then translate that into the iPad. And it's thinner than ever. And like, I read off a Kindle all the time. I would love for my Kindle to be half the size, half the weight, right? So like, there's good in this. And I always want us as a podcast, as Christians, just generally in the world, when someone says, oh, have you seen that latest whatever? Do we receive the good, or do we just critique the bad? What is the good? I invited Dr. Jess Jelstra to come speak to our church. She ran a workshop, and she had this provocative statement. She's a theologian at Redeemer University. And she said, I want to tell you why pornography is good. And she said, don't kick me out. But she's like, we need to receive and see God's good gifts in everything. And she said, I think we can all agree that pornography is terrible. And yet there is something there of the love between a man and a woman that properly in God's ordering is getting taken away in porn. Yes, but it's taken away. It's mashing up something good. There's something good in sex. There's something good in male and female. There's something good in sexual relationships and affection in physical ways. That is good. So like, yes, porn is bad. We should all, try to, steer culture away from porn and even implement laws that go to that effect. I talked with my MPP about this recently. Like I'm against it. And yet there is a good that exists. Augustine would say it this way, that if something doesn't have some kind of good in it, then it doesn't exist at all.
Right.
All that Satan has at his disposal is to take good things and then to taint them in a little bit, in a little way or a little that way, and to deprive the good out of them. But fundamentally, if it exists, there's something good there. And so, yeah, so like, I think there's good in this iPad. Like Joel, and you're looking skeptical. You're like, porn is evil, 100%. I'm like, yes, porn is bad, but there is something, like, if you just think about what it is.
Yeah, no.
There's something good there that is getting abused in a terrible way, but it only has the capture that it does on our culture because of some of the good that it's twisting.
Yeah, no, it's a profound statement. And I was like, just absorbing it. Cause I'm like, oh man, this is making me think. Like, like you said, it's creation. And God creates, Satan destroys, right? So I think there's an interesting aspect to kind of dwell on about, like, yeah, things that maybe people like just say, hey, this is black and white, and not like actually have a nuanced understanding of it. I mean, for the iPad, it might be pretty black and white. I don't know what people use it for. No, I'm joking. But I mean, personally, I haven't ever got an iPad. It's like I have a couple of them and they're like just sit around doing nothing. But when I was looking at the specs of this new one you mentioned earlier, it's like one of the most powerful ones. It's using the latest M4 chip that is also in their laptops. And I think part of the challenge with these devices is it doesn't have Mac OS. It has like iPad OS. And the software,
it's nowhere near as good as Mac OS.
It's just not as useful because it limits what you can do. And I think the vision is that, hey, if there were developers who made the applications to take advantage of this new medium, it could be really impressive. One of the things they have with this new M4 chip is the ability to do 38 trillion of operations per second. Like I think I mentioned in the past when we talked about AI, this new acronym TOPS, trillion of operations per second, is kind of what people are using to say how powerful is this like GPU at running AI. So 38 is like pretty powerful. 60, 100, those are some like the latest NVIDIA Jetson compute edge devices. So it's punching really high. But the thing is, who's really running, AI compute? One of the interesting things that is probably affecting the perception of this is that Apple has later in the year their software event, WWDC, where they may say, oh, now we have the software and this is how we'll take advantage of the hardware. So it's almost like a misstep in messaging of like, yeah, we have this super powerful thin device, which is really impressive, but what's a killer app? How is it going to be used? How is that going to actually change the world? Or is it just thinner for vanity's sake?
Right. And what is the demand even for a thinner iPad? I just bought my wife an iPad a little over a month ago for her birthday, and they're already really, really small as is. Like the thinness of an iPad is already pretty thin. I had one of the very first iPads, and it was quite a bit bulkier than even the current iPad Pros are. And so I want to know, like, what demand is being met here with the smallness of the iPad being its biggest selling feature. Like, what value does that actually add when the iPads are already pretty small as is?
Yeah, some people I think this is an interesting take. Some people kind of criticize Apple based on the CEO, right? So it's like, okay, Tim Cook, he's more operational. he is looking at maximize profits. Steve Jobs, creative visionary, and he's like, hey, like this is how this is going to change everything. So when the iPad Air first came out, it's like, hey, it can fit in a manila envelope, right? There was like came out with like, this is why this is so cool. Look, it makes it like affects portability. It's a big game changer. Versus like that message is now diluted because maybe it's not coming from the top, that every product has to be released with like this intentionality of like the message, right? I mean, it's easy to say this without knowing the inner workings of Apple, but another device that they launched recently, there was a lot of internal debate on the Apple Vision Pro not being ready for prime time. And it came out, and I have also complex feelings on that, because I do really appreciate that they made something really impressive, and it really is more like for the developers with the crazy price tag that it has.
Right.
But people again are like, oh, it's too heavy, right?
Yeah.
And that's why people are like not really using it. And it seems like they're going to accelerate the next version coming out, and like that might be the version that actually is more useful. But it's very interesting that people could say, are a couple of these missteps based on leadership, or you know, what is the root cause behind some of these, you know, decisions?
That's interesting, because I'm running a 2022 M2 MacBook Pro, which was the first MacBook that I purchased in 10 years. I made my 2012 MacBook Pro go a solid decade, because from 2014 through like 2020-ish, Apple just lost the plot when it came to pro computing. They started pushing features that pro users weren't asking for. They started taking away functionality that pro users were relying on a daily basis. One of my friends has, one of my bandmates has one of those older, but like 2018, 2019 MacBook Pro, and he has to have a bunch of dongles to get him functionality that MacBook Pro users used to take for granted being built in. And this one was the first one to begin reincorporating some of that. And so it seems as though in the aftermath of Steve Jobs passing, that Apple's been like kind of on a journey to like find and rediscover itself. And it's getting closer and closer to trying to recapture some of that. But it had to wade through a lot of, we're going to continue to spin the wheel, but in a way that our core fan base, the diehard Apple fans, can't fully understand or like even sell the hype behind themselves. Like, I can't tell you why you should buy an Apple Vision Pro. And I have like 10 Apple devices in my house. Like, if you've lost the core Apple user, who else is there to really appeal to, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. And we talked about it. Sorry, Andrew. We talked about it before, like why they're trying to push the Apple Vision Pro. It's like, I think, again, maybe this is, again, reading the tea leaves too much, but I think like Tim Cook is planning to step down, and he wanted to have a legacy on how he shaped Apple. So he's like, I'm bringing this new medium of the Apple Vision Pro, and I took it from just a device handset sort of screen company to this new paradigm, right? And I think maybe in the pursuit of some of these accolades, you know, it kind of loses the first principles of like talk to customers and building what people need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think like there's a few different ways that we can go with this. Like at the core of the commercial, you have the crushing of things and the withstanding of the iPad, which is only going to be replaced like 10 years from now. We won't even think about this version of the iPad, right? So it's interesting that something like a piano is going to last the test of time far more than the iPad will. Like and I just think about like, from a Christian perspective, we are interested in human flourishing, the discipleship and the evangelization and the making disciples of all the nations. We're interested in loving our neighbor. Like, out of all the objects that were in that commercial, the things and the devices, which are more which do you pick to make disciples, or which do you pick for flourishing the world and loving our neighbor? Like what actually does that? Because that's what we care about. And that should be the telos, the point, the goal of these objects should fill that vision and fill the world with that vision. Does it do that? Is that like back to the question of like, is thinner just a vanity project?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like,
I mean, I'll take one side of it. I do think, and this may be the controversial side, I do think, like, in the pursuit of thinner, you can create some pretty impressive things that will have, like, let's say, kingdom impacts, right? So I think, like, people having access to knowledge, right, and it's like being able to look at that on your phone, those type of things do make a big impact, because now people can carry the Bible around them without having to carry a big Bible, and now you always have like that access to it. So I think at a 10,000 foot level, it can be really good. The specific iPad, I think, with this level of thinness, like if you're talking about like, millimeters, I think now you can take the iPad and even like connect it to kiosks or some other system, use that processing power, and you can build something around it that also is like pretty useful, right? Like that you can take with you on different trips, and that extra space may be in some situations valuable. But yeah, I think generally it's going to be hard to defend.
Well, I was just reading Tony Reinke's book, 12 Ways That Phone is Changing You. Yeah, and he obviously, because he works so closely with John Piper, refers to him a lot. John Piper, a famous Bible teacher, pastor, and John Piper, an early adopter. And he says at the end of the book that when John Piper looks down at his iPad or whatever tablet he has, I think it's an iPad, his computer, and his phone, he nearly weeps with joy and gratitude. Like he's nearly in tears and thanks to God for these devices, because they so aid him in reading, learning, and teaching the Bible. Like I'm part of a Logos. Logos is a Bible software. There's constantly discussion in the Facebook group about, oh man, we'd love for there to be more apps, or maybe Logos should come out with their own tablet that like really fulfills all the potential of Logos Bible software. But at the end of the day, like they could use the iPad app, and it's pretty good to my knowledge.
It's actually great. Like actually using as someone with an iPad and Logos on it, like using Logos on an iPad is at times better than using it on my Mac. It's a lot more intuitive and just kind of snappier than Logos on desktop is.
Yeah, and there's preachers that preach off of iPads because they can put the text on the screen and then circle the text as they talk about it and things like that. Now I'm against that. We won't get into that in this video, but, but I think this comes back to like a distinction. So you have this referenced in a few different modern books. So Andy Crouch talks about it in The Life We're Looking For. I have John Dyer's book, From the Garden to the City. He talks about it. If you have that book, the latest version of that book, the second edition, page 199, he talks about this, the difference of tools and devices, referring to an older book by Albert Borgman, which was written like 70 years ago. And he makes the distinction between things and devices. So things are readily apparent what they do. They don't conceal their doing utility in the world. Yeah. The way of a device kind of hides it. It conceals it. It's like when I look at Joel's background and I see all those physical objects that are back there that do things, they're all pretty concealed what they do. Whereas a violin, a guitar, a metronome, a piano, like there is a visual aid and a transparency to what they do. He also talks about the promise of technology and the disburdenment that comes with it. So it's like, it's always trying to take something off your shoulders, but then that also isolates and creates more loneliness. As it takes away the burdens, it also creates new challenges and problems because it's reducing your whatever it is. There is this domination of nature. Borgman has this like beautiful reference back to an earlier book where someone talks about making wheels, and like this guy, he does not understand colonizing as a denomination of nature, and colonizing in a different sense, but like he doesn't understand like ruling over creation as a domination of nature, as conquering and subduing, but rather as an adaptation of people to the land. He says that it's an age-long effort of the Englishman to get themselves close and ever closer to England. Like there is this weaving, and Wendell Berry is famous for this weaving of people to live in accordance to nature rather than us to domineer nature. So things live in accordance to nature, whereas devices have a paradigm that is about dominating nature. And there's also consumerism as part of devices and other things. And John Dyer, he like lists his own, from effort to attention, from creating to remixing, from presence to connection, from extending to replacing. And he kind of creates his own list of, okay, well, there are tools that can be good, but then there's other things, a device paradigm that is not as good because of the ways in which it just doesn't do the things you want it to do to you. It's more about a consumption. Like an iPad can be just a consumption device. Apple Vision Pro can be just a consumption device. And I find this paradigm helpful. But then when I think about the iPad, I'm like, it can be both.
Yeah.
I actually struggle to because I can see an artist using it and creating these amazing digital works of art, which are still works of art, despite them not being embodied in that way.
Right. And I think there's something to be said to how much the tool versus device paradigm is something imposed from the top down, as it's like it's inherently baked into the things that we're talking about and then forced upon people, versus how much of that is self-selected from the individual up. Meaning that is the iPad a device because you can use it to just binge as much video content as your eyeballs can stuff into them, or do you lack self-control and restraint in, no, I'm going to proactively make choices about the things that I watch and the things I spend my time, and from a sense of virtue and direction, choose to use the iPad to be a tool for those purposes. I think we could sometimes get stuck in this thing. It's like, well, because a thing can do all these things, therefore it will do all those things. It's going to do all those things. It's going to be a device paradigm for everyone, when media ecology goes both ways. Our devices do not do things just because they present us with the option of doing those things. We still have to choose to do those things. We still have to decide what we're going to use these things for. And it's not our device's fault if we end up doing things that we don't like, that we shouldn't be doing. That ultimately springs forth from our hearts and from the choices we make.
Yep. Yeah. The tech critic who blames technology for all the world's problems and not the humans both using and creating the machines, like that's a non-starter for me. It's like, no, where does the responsibility lie from a Christian point of view? It's totally, as people who build products, they have a responsibility to build the products in certain ways, but so too do the users. We can't just pick and choose who's responsible and escape blame. That's like a common thread in our culture right now. It's like blame shifting. It's like, it's the government's fault. It's social media's fault. It's big tech, big pharma.
Right.
Pick your systemic issue, systemic racism, systemic whatever. Like, these systemic things are the real problem, but you and me, we're not the problem. It's like, no.
Right.
The problems are complex. There are systemic problems, but there's also individual sin, and we are responsible for the habits and behaviors, and that's going to be individualized. So yeah, someone like I want John Piper to get the latest iPad, and create great Bible study videos to the glory of God. Like his look in the book stuff, like we'll play a video of it.
Is great.
It's just
Super
like
good.
using the technology of what, and Tony Rank, who worked with him to set up this great setup so that it's just seamless from teaching the text, and you're looking at the text, so that in the same way that God said to Moses, like, I'm going to write this down for you. You take this to the people, you all look at it. Like God invented the written word, so to speak. And similarly, that we have this obligation to look at the word. And so, yeah, let's look at it on LED screens. Or Joel, you can tell me the more technical names for what these are. Apparently there's like dual layer stuff with the new iPad. Like it's like complex machinery that goes into it so that it doesn't harm your eyes, so that it has dynamic stuff that goes on with it.
And I want to steel man the iPad here for a second from my fellow tech critics. That iPad is a marvelous, breathtakingly incredible work of human ingenuity and creativity and wisdom. Just because it's crushing, instruments and paint cans and, all these, traditional creative tools, doesn't mean that the iPad itself is not an absolute creative wonder in how it's made. We can have a double standard here that's like, oh, well, these tech devices are pitted against a truer or deeper or richer type of creativity. And that's just not true. The team that worked to build that iPad are, I would assume, some of the most creative people you may ever meet, some of the most imaginative people you may ever meet. It might look differently than writing a song or painting a portrait, but it's still human creativity and exercise.
Yeah, no, I think it is. It's very impressive. Like, and even, like we talked about the thinness a bunch, but the display, I think it's like there's a pro version and it's like an OLED display, and the dual layers of LEDs there allow you to get like this really rich color, like dark blacks and stuff like that, which, it's appealing, right? Like from an aesthetic point of view, if you can create art with a deeper reflection of color and reality, it's like a deeper reflection of the creation of God, right? Of our world, what we can see. So I think there's beauty in that. And it's an engineering marvel for sure. And even I think thinness may not be the right metric. Like I think from a weight perspective, I can see, if this is lighter and you're, a doctor and you're holding this up throughout your day as you're it's helping you with diagnosis and stuff like that. Then it's like that weight actually will affect how easy it is to carry it throughout the day and the burden it has on you. So I think there are other metrics that they could have combined in addition to thinness that would communicate some more of the value. More on the marketing angle than the engineering angle here.
Yeah. Well, and that's what this is kind of about, is the marketing and the way that these things are spun. Like, I think the reality is that a lot of the technology is promising a lot right now with AI, where we've had smartphones for over a dozen years now, right? Like we really haven't seen a new smartphone. It's just a more impressive camera or a more impressive this or that. There's only so many spec improvements that don't wow us. In the 2000s, there was this kind of gadget industry, and there was all these websites, there was all these cool gadgets coming out. There's this kind of camera, there's this Polaroid, there's this little, thing that you can attach to your flip phone in order to do this. There's just this world of gadgets. And now it's been systematized into these big companies, and there's less of the little guy in these bigger spaces. And then the little guys come out with these AI in a box things that suck, but we'll get into that on a separate episode.
Save that for another episode.
Yeah. But I as we're thinking forward, the future of Apple is probably going to come out with some more updates later this summer. I think that there was probably a marketing decision made here of okay, what are we going to emphasize? We need to have a big thing because this is a big event. We haven't updated the iPad in a while. We need to put a bunch of money into an ad. What are we going to emphasize? Well, we can't do any of the software stuff because that's going to come later this summer at the next event. So I guess it has to be the hardware. Okay, well, we moved the camera from this side to this side. Okay, we're not going to throw a bunch of money at moving the camera so that it's in landscape mode. What are we going to throw the money at? Well, it's the thinnest Apple device ever, which is pretty amazing. I had an iPod when I was in grade 12. That was incredibly thin, that iPod. I loved it because it was a big upgrade from my MP3 player that only stored 13 songs. So it was like this huge step forward in technology, and it's literally thinner than an iPod. Like, I can't even imagine that thinness. We get our devices next week. Just so you guys know, Apple sponsored this podcast. So we're doing our video. Thanks for laughing, knowing that we're not that big yet. By the way, support us on Patreon. We will not spend your money on iPads for ourselves. But the future of Apple, what is it like? And what do you guys think? Like, we've focused in on the iPad. That question of discipleship, would Jesus use an iPad? You know, is this something that, when we think about Jesus and embodying the life that Jesus would want us to live out, is there space for an iPad in the world of ministry and in the world of Christians who work in tech?
Yeah, absolutely. One critique I would make of my own side, and my side being more on the tech critic side of things, is that tech critics can often confuse forms of godliness with the power of godliness. And they're not the same thing. The forms of our godliness are not the source of our power. They may allow us to display that power more clearly or more compellingly. But unless the Spirit is present in the work that we do, no form can substitute for the Spirit's work. And so, yeah, an iPad is absolutely something that ministers and people working in tech is a perfectly viable tool for that end. But if you're thinking, oh, because I have an iPad, I'm now maybe more predisposed to effectiveness in my ministry or in my work, that you might want to reconsider that, because the true source of your work, especially if you're in ministry, doesn't come from your own techniques or your own tools, but from the power of the Spirit working through those things to change the hearts and minds of people.
Yeah. And I think I would add on and say, yeah, I think, Jesus would tech it where it's like, hey, in good wisdom, it's like, if I'm looking at two cars or two objects, hey, like this one will actually have some tangible trade-off, and it's wise to use it. So I think, like, the future of Apple, Andrew, you kind of like posited what is that? I think they're going to go through a tough period right now because they seem to have lost the plot. But when they eventually come out with the AI stuff and Siri actually is like useful, and now it's like this assistant in your pocket and like all of that stuff is, the vision is there. Then it's like, okay, this is really impressive. So I think, Joel's stock pick of the week is to buy the dip on Apple if you can.
That's fair. Is it dipping in the stock market? I have not even looked at that.
It was, and then they did a buyback. But anyways, that's
right. And just explain the buyback. We're not going to do a whole episode on that, but that's basically like Apple flexing because they have so much money, right?
Yeah, they've been so profitable, and they've actually had a problem effectively deploying their capital into like innovation. They put a lot in.
What do we do with all of our money? Oh no.
So they just been storing it up. Yeah, they've just been storing it up, and now they're like, okay, I don't know, there's 1 billion shares on the market, and we're going to buy a bunch of them. And then that creates buying power to push up the price. So that when they buy back shares on the market, you reduce available shares, and that increases the price, supply and demand sort of thing.
Okay, that's helpful. I think Apple's greedy. Is that a fair statement? They're far too greedy.
I'm sure there are people at Apple who are greedy. I don't know if it's greedy or business sense.
But the whole business, like this new iPad, the pencil, like you need to buy the latest Apple Pencil to use it with this iPad. You can't use an old Apple Pencil with this new iPad because the charging location of it needs to be in a certain way. So they needed to reconfigure it, is the logic behind it. Marcus Brownlee talks about it in his review video. I just find that Apple has some techniques in order to make more money.
Oh yeah. Like the dongle
And-
business and all of that. Yeah, there's a lot of examples where it's like
Unnecessary greed. Like,
Yes.
corporate greed.
Well, the dongle business was the sole reason why I didn't buy a MacBook for 10 years. Literally, that is the sole reason why I made my 2012 MacBook Pro, and I rebuilt it a couple of times, because it's like, no, I'm not playing this game. I'm not going to pay you extra money to get basic functionality that is a very reasonable expectation for a pro computer.
It'll be interesting if you had a chart that said how much profit they made by, like, you know, their case that's $100 case, which actually costs them $10, versus like, hey, this is an engineering marvel that actually costs billions of dollars to do the R&D on display technology, right? I think I can admire one a lot more than the other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been thinking through the 7 deadly sins of Snapchat, and I just find that as soon as you think about technology, you start realizing how embedded both users and creators are embedded in sin, and those 7: pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust. Like, there's a lot of people that look at this new iPad and it's just lust, and it's envy, and it's wanting to not miss out, and it's just like, we need to really assess where we're at when we are interested in purchasing these things. And if we're asking the right questions, does this glorify God? Does this model Jesus? And that's what we're trying to do on this podcast, to think about these things, not just in the abstract, not just as media critics, but for the sake of our discipleship with one another and for the sake of yours too. And so if you've enjoyed this episode, if you have perhaps thought more deeply than just what you might have gotten on Twitter, because maybe Twitter just gave you a one-sided whatever, or whatever. I don't know. Twitter can be helpful too. Let's not go into that. But if you've enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it with someone. Feel free to support us on Patreon. We appreciate it. And as always, thank you for listening. And until next time, use tech, find rest, and glorify God. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye.